looking at Acts chapter 18. Do you hear the call is the theme. So last week was an in-depth look at one of those speeches in the book of Acts. And this week there is no speech as such, but there are some pretty amazing things that happen in this chapter. So just as a bit of a recap, because hopefully you haven't, but if you're anything like me, you have forgotten last week. And when Josh was talking, Paul was in Athens, and this week he's moved into Corinth, and much of the chapter focuses on Corinth. In fact, the whole chapter is pretty much focused on Corinth, because even though Paul leaves, we meet someone at the end who goes into Corinth and is of great benefit there as well. So Corinth itself was a big city, a very important city in the Roman Empire, and it was wealthy, it was rich. This is a reconstruction of a particularly notorious temple in Corinth. It was the temple of Aphrodite, and she was the goddess of love, so you can kind of imagine what kind of things happened there. There were 1,000 female servants who spread the good news of Aphrodite with their particular talents. I won't go into any more detail, but thankfully this is what it looks like today. A bit less spectacular, a bit less grand. In fact, much of the city is in ruins today, but you can still go and have a look around at a whole bunch of interesting ruins that are there. And we'll have a look at a couple more photos as we go through the chapter. And this is another reconstruction, artist's impression, if you like, of perhaps what it was like when Paul was there, with the marketplace in the middle, and we'll visit that a little later. So there's an interesting detail that we'll also see later, which allows us to pinpoint exactly, pretty much, when all of these events took place. And in fact, in this chapter, we have the most precisely dateable event in the life of Paul. And it's thanks to an archaeological discovery, which we'll see. So Corinth was an important city in the Roman Empire, and it also became a very important place for the believers. There was a large church there, and I'll probably accidentally call it ecclesia. That's the Greek word, and we often use that phrase to refer to the believers, the group of believers that meet in that place. So if I say ecclesia and you've got no idea what I'm talking about, try and remember that it's just a Greek word that means believers. So Paul, later on, the ecclesia was so important, the church was so important in Corinth, that he wrote at least 3 letters to the believers there, and we've got 2 of them preserved in the New Testament. And you can read them, 1st and 2nd of Corinthians, named after the meeting there. So Corinth itself had been around for a long time, and it had a pretty interesting history, if you like history. But it was destroyed in 146 BC, totally destroyed, and then it was rebuilt, I think, by Julius Caesar in about 44 BC. So by the time Paul comes along, it's been around for about 100 odd years. And it was wealthy because of its location, and also because of that temple which we mentioned before, which attracted all sorts of, shall we say, interesting characters. It was an evil place, an immoral place, and not one that you would expect to have great success when you were preaching Christ. So when Jimmy read that for us this evening, we first of all met a couple called Aquila and Priscilla, who likely are Jews, and they feature often later in the New Testament. They meet Paul here, and they become close friends and vital, in fact, for the ecclesia in Ephesus and also in Corinth here. They do a lot of work, and it's interesting, just before we have a little bit more of a look at them, there's an interesting archaeological fact here, because it says that Claudius, in verse 2, had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and that's why Aquila and Priscilla were in Corinth, because they'd been kicked out of Rome along with a whole bunch of other Jews. Now, I just want to put this man's picture up. This is Sir William Ramsay, who was an archaeologist, historian, so on, and he was actually a professor at Oxford, and he was very anti-biblical, and he was very sceptical of Christianity. And in fact, he was so sceptical that he knew that if he could go and disprove the book of Acts, then he would pretty much, blow the whole Bible away, and he could prove once and for all that it was an absolute ridiculous joke. So he literally set out to discredit the book of Acts by digging around in Israel and in the places where Paul journeyed in the book of Acts. And much to his dismay, he actually ended up viewing the Gospel of Luke and also the book of Acts, who were both written by the same person, Luke. And he had this to say about Luke. There are reasons for placing the author of the Acts among the historians of the first rank. That's a weird way of saying that he viewed Luke as one of the best types of historians that you could possibly imagine. And the reason is, Luke, when he says something in Acts, it's almost certainly happened. And this is no different, this little detail here. Claudius commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. Well, surprise, surprise, this is a picture of Claudius, who was the Caesar in AD 41 to 54, and he commanded the Jews to leave Rome. And it's confirmed in history by three different sources that he did that. So there's one that's written very early, like quite close to when Paul is in Corinth, AD 69 to 122. And there's one that's mentioned a bit later, and then there's one that's mentioned in the 5th century as well. So all of these people who wrote about history outside of the New Testament all said, yep, Claudius did kick the Jews out of Rome around that time. So there's another detail we'll have a look at later, which also is verifiable with history. So Luke is a precise historian. Right, so now let's have a look at Aquila and Priscilla briefly. It says that they were tent makers in verse 3. Paul also was a tent maker. It says he was of the same trade, and he stayed with them, and they made tents. And it says that Paul actually spent every Sabbath, in verse 4, in the synagogues teaching the Jews and the Greeks. So presumably that meant for the rest of the week he was busy making tents to pay his way. So Aquila and Priscilla are mentioned very favourably in the New Testament. It says in Romans chapter 16 by Paul that they risked their necks for my life. They put their lives on the line to save Paul. We're not told what that event was. In 1 Corinthians, that letter we mentioned before, that Paul wrote to Corinth, while he was in Ephesus, I think, he sends that message to the Corinthian ecclesia saying that Aquila and Priscilla, who are here with me, send you loving greetings, hearty greetings. And also, when he's writing to Timothy, he tells Timothy to say hello to Priscilla and Aquila. So as Paul's moving around, Priscilla and Aquila were a very integral part of the growth of the early churches in the New Testament period. So it's interesting that Paul should pay his own way while he's in Corinth, and he actually explains why he does it. He does it in Ephesus as well, and he does it in Rome as well. But in 1 Corinthians 9, he actually explains why. And it's quite incredible, Paul's attitude. So, in fact, it was in Jewish law that you were allowed to have a bit of a benefit when you are labouring for God. So there's this quote that says, you don't muzzle the ox while it's treading the corn, because they would harness an ox to a mill and it would walk around and crush the corn as it's walking around. And they said, because the ox is doing the work, you don't put a muzzle in its mouth, you let it eat when it feels like it. And that was like a principle that Paul could have used to justify, taking a living from the people he was preaching the truth to. But he chose not to. He chose to turn his back on what would have been justifiable. And the reason he gives is there in 1 Corinthians 9, and in verse 12, he says, I would endure anything, rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. He says he made himself a servant of all so that he might win more. So Paul pays his way just in case there was some shrewd Jew that said, oh, you're only doing this for the money. You're not actually doing this at all because you love Christ. You're just doing it for what you can get out of it. So he completely removed that argument from the equation wherever he went and paid his way, which is amazing. And it actually says in that other quote that I've got there, 2 Corinthians 6, in verse 10, it says that Paul wasn't wealthy at all. He was living quite poorly, but he said he did that so that he could make many rich. So his attitude was one of humility and sacrifice, because he was giving this and he was determined to give this gospel freely, which perhaps is in stark contrast to some of the preachers of today who seem to be all about money and prosperity and reaping a reward when you sow a seed and so on and so forth. Paul was not like that at all. And it says that he spent every Sabbath in the synagogue, in verse 4, trying to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. And then it says in verse 5 that Silas and Timothy came. Timothy. Now, we'll go back to our map here. So, sorry, it's small on my screen. Corinth is there. So when Josh was talking to us, they were in Berea last time, and Paul said he wanted to go down to Achaia, which is the region where Corinth is, and they said, yep, that's a great idea. So off he went down to Athens, which is where he did the talk on Mars Hill that Josh talked about last time. And it says that the people who were in Berea, some of them accompanied Paul all the way down to Athens. And Silas and Timothy were left up in Berea to sort of help out there. And these people that came down with Paul to Athens, when Paul left them, he said, go back to Berea and tell Silas and Timothy to meet me, to catch up with me. And then Paul moves off to Corinth, they go back here, and then they tell them to come and meet him. So if you were given the task to find Paul in a large city, with no mobile phones, no GPS tracking, how would you find him? Does anyone know how you'd find Paul? Anyone? In the synagogue. That's very good. It was super predictable. Every Sabbath, Paul was there, which is actually Saturday. Paul was there preaching about Jesus to the Jews that were gathered there, and he devoted his time and energy to teach there. So all Silas and Timothy had to do was go to Corinth and find the synagogue, and there Paul would be. And there he was, and they met up. So it says that as Paul preached, in verse 6, it got to a point where the Jews were pretty much sick to death of what Paul was teaching. They didn't agree, and it says that they opposed him and blasphemed him. It really means they said nasty things about him, and they made it very difficult for him, and he could tell that he was no longer welcome there. And so he says in verse 6 something which is quite interesting. He says, your blood be upon your own heads, I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. But the interesting bit is that your blood be on your own heads bit, because it tells you just what Paul thought about the message he was teaching. This wasn't just some bunch of interesting facts that you could take or leave. To say your blood be on your own head is really to say, I've tried my very best to save your life. And by you turning your back on my message and walking away from it and pushing me away, you're actually choosing to die. You are giving away life, and you will die, but it's not going to be my fault because I've tried my hardest to save you. So your blood will be on your own heads. That's how Paul viewed it. Life and death. That was the gospel to Paul. That was the message and the importance of it, and that's why he went through so much in his teaching. So then it says he goes on to focus on preaching to the Gentiles, and that in itself was no small thing for someone like Paul, who was a Jew, and he was not just any old Jew. He'd actually been one of the elite Jewish teachers in Jerusalem, and he was very well qualified. He had a bright future ahead of him, and when he converted to following Christ, he actually left all of that behind and turned his back on it. But that didn't mean he became an anti-Jew, and in fact you'll see later on in the chapter he is still doing Jewish things and even following some of the customs of the law. He didn't turn his back on Jews, and he focused his attention everywhere he went, first of all on the Jews, and then afterwards he would turn to the Gentiles, because inevitably the Jews would reject him. But he was someone who was used to being upright and keeping himself from defilement and uncleanness. And here he is in Corinth, which is pretty much, you would imagine, one of the most unclean places to a Jew. And yet out he goes into the marketplaces, calling out and preaching about Jesus. He didn't shrink back. So it says that Paul didn't really have to move very far when he moved out of the synagogue. He actually moved next door to a man called, in some translations it says Titius Justus. In mine it's just a certain man named Justus, who was next door to the synagogue, and he was one who worshipped God. So this man's a Gentile, and there was a little bit of debate actually as to whether he was still staying with Priscilla and Aquila or whether he moved in with this man. Some argue that perhaps he did move in with this man because he's a Gentile, and in order to, back up his words and say, I'm going away from the Jews, I'm going to move in with this Gentile. Ironically, he's right next to the synagogue, and you can imagine the tension that would create with the Jews, on the Sabbath day, rolling up and going inside the synagogue to listen to the law. And outside there's this rabble, this noise, because there's crowds of people gathering at the house next door because of this weirdo Paul who's been teaching stuff that just doesn't fit with what we believe. You can imagine the tension that would build and grow as time went by. You can almost tell that there's something bad that's going to happen. It's brewing, and it's going to come to a head any moment. And on top of that, he actually converts, in verse 8, Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. So the person who stood up the front and did the announcements and made sure things ran well, he decides that he's going to follow Paul. He gets baptised, his whole family gets baptised, and presumably, we'll see later on, he's not welcome in the synagogue anymore either. So definitely the pressure is being turned up, and Paul is in for something nasty. And I think he's probably starting to feel a bit worried and a bit concerned. And this is where something incredible happens. Now, the book of Acts, when we talk about it, and in fact, I'm just going to have a look at the front. In my Bible, it says the Acts of the Apostles. But it probably should be called the Acts of Jesus through the Apostles. And I think Jimmy might have actually mentioned this on the first talk for the year. Because Jesus himself appears to Paul in a vision at a point where he's quite low, quite worried, quite concerned about what might happen. And Jesus appears to Paul and personally speaks to him. And in my Bible, the words of Jesus are in red, and there they are. Haven't seen red words on the page for quite a while, but they jump out at you here. Jesus is speaking to Paul. And that's quite amazing. He says, "Do not be afraid, Paul. Keep speaking. Don't be silent, because I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city." And so Paul keeps going, encouraged by this vision from the Lord, and he teaches for another 1.5 years, without incident, it appears, teaching the word of God. But then comes some more history, some more historically verifiable stuff. There's a man called Gallio, who was a proconsul or governor of Achaia. Now, let's go back to our map. Achaia, whoops, we were already on the map, weren't we? That was dumb. Achaia is this region here, and Corinth was the capital of that region. So Gallio was governor of that whole region, and this is Luke saying it. He's putting himself out there for being discredited if it's wrong, but not surprisingly, we have proof from archaeology. They unearthed an inscription in stone in a temple in Delphi, and it actually, can you see the blue box? I think that actually is Gallio's name highlighted for you. I can't read Greek, but you can sort of work it out when you know what the letters sound like. So Gallio, it says in this inscription, he was governor of Achaia. It actually confirms that. It specifically states it. And it also, this is a Caesar that's writing to Gallio and encouraging him to do what he can to repopulate a city that had a population that was in decline. And it dates the letter by the Caesar who's ruling at the time. And because we know exactly when that Caesar ruled, we can work out almost exactly when Paul is in Corinth and when all of this happens. And it seems like the Jews have waited until Gallio is proconsul of Achaia. Apparently in those days you were only proconsul for a year. So they've waited for the old fellow to move on. It's Gallio's turn, and they think, right, now's our chance. We're going to make an impression on this man, and we're going to drag Paul before him. And so they do. Yeah, that's pretty much what I just said. But as I said at the start of the night, this is the detail that is the most well-known date in the whole life of Paul because of that inscription that they've unearthed. But I'm sure if they keep digging, they'll find other things that verify the record. There's no reason to doubt, because in so many places, Luke the historian has been verified beyond doubt. So, Gallio's proconsul, and that says that the Jews, with one accord, all united together, and they rose up against Paul. And you might think, hang on a minute, didn't Jesus say, no one's going to attack you, no one's going to hurt you? Well, let's see what happens. They drag Paul to the judgment seat. Now, in Corinth, there's also this place here, which is called the Bema in Corinth. And the Bema in Corinth was an elevated platform. I think it's about 2.5 metres high, so quite high up. And it's near the marketplace. So what happened in those days is the proconsul would actually make judgments and make announcements from that platform up high in front of the marketplace. And you can imagine when things are happening, a crowd would gather expecting something exciting to happen. And that's what would have been happening here. Paul would have been up there in front of everyone while the Jews made their accusation against him. You know, shouting and accusing Paul of, as it says there in verse 13, this fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. Now, that archaeologist that I mentioned before, William Ramsay, Sir William Ramsay, he says that this moment was actually a really, really important turning point in the history of the development of the early first century church. And it's because if this had gone badly for Paul, you can imagine what the Jews would have done with it. So if Gallio had said, right, you're not to preach here, and maybe even locked him up, put him in prison or something, the Jews would have taken that as like the legal word, it's precedent. It means, it's an example that we can use over and over again wherever we go to say, well, Gallio said that Paul was bad and he can't preach, so you should also do the same thing as Gallio. Here was their opportunity to really smash this teaching that Paul was spreading, and it was spreading quite popularly through the city of Corinth. They had their opportunity here. The crowds are gathered. And they've made their accusation that Paul is teaching contrary to the law, and I'm sure Paul would have known that this was a really important moment. So thoughts are flashing through his mind. He's framing what he's about to say. He goes to open his mouth in verse 14, but then Gallio cuts in front of him and he doesn't even have to speak. So, sorry, my PowerPoint gets ahead of me, or my mind gets ahead of my PowerPoint. He didn't even need to speak because Gallio just said, basically, I couldn't care less about you and your law, Jews. I refuse to have anything to do with making a judgment on this matter. It's up to you. You go and do what you want, but I'm not going to make a judgment at all. And it says he drove them from the judgment seat. So they're up there alongside Paul, pointing the finger, and Gallio and his soldiers just pushes them down the stairs and out into the marketplace and says, just be gone with you, I don't care, go away. And that in itself signalled that Paul's teaching was of no threat to Rome, and it was a turning point, a victory actually, a victory that meant that Christianity could spread rapidly in the reign of the Emperor Claudius and in subsequent emperors as well. So Paul didn't have to use any wise words, he didn't have to make any dramatic speech. Gallio did it for him in a not particularly eloquent speech, but a very powerful one that basically finished the matter. And it meant that Paul was free to teach about Jesus, and it silenced the Jews. They couldn't say anything more against Paul. So it's an amazing success at the point where you think, how could it get any worse? Paul could probably imagine everything falling apart in front of him and being thrown into prison, and yet Jesus intervenes through this man from the most unexpected place and rules in Paul's favour. And then it says that Paul was then, because of that, he was free to stay many days longer, which he did. But I missed the best bit, didn't I? When Gallio drove them off the platform, you can imagine him pushing them out into the marketplace where all these Corinthians had gathered, waiting for some spectacular show, and it ends up being a fizzer. And they're so frustrated that they turned on the Jews and they grabbed the ruler of the synagogue, Crispus. Remember, Crispus was the ruler of the synagogue in verse 8? No, it's not Crispus, is it? It's verse 17. It's Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue. So it looks like Crispus has lost his job and he's been replaced. And then the Greeks, the Corinthians, are bashing him in front of the governor who's standing up on the platform, and he just turns a blind eye and walks away and leaves them to pound poor Sosthenes senseless, presumably. So quite a dramatic finish. So it says that Paul remained a good while, and then he decided to move on and set sail for Syria. So he took Aquila and Priscilla with him. Get my pointer out again. So he moved off, and Ephesus. Oh, sorry. It is really small on my screen. Corinth is here, and he moved across and moved to Ephesus next. And it says that when he came to Cenchrea, I'm sure that's not how you pronounce it, he cut his hair off. Now, that place is just out of Corinth, just down on the coast. So he'd made this vow, and this is it's presumably a Jewish vow, which is in Numbers chapter 6 and verse 5. It was the law of the Nazarite, which Jews were voluntarily free to do. They were under no obligation to do it. It was of their own free will. They would devote themselves to serving God and keeping themselves pure for a time. So they wouldn't drink any alcohol of any form. They wouldn't even touch grapes or sultanas or grape juice, anything from the vine. They wouldn't touch. They wouldn't cut their hair the entire time of the vow. They wouldn't go near a dead body. Even if one of their family members died, they would stay away from that dead body. And then at the end of it all, they would cut their hair in front of the temple. Paul's not near the temple, but presumably he took his hair with him because he heads to Jerusalem next. And they would take an offering, and with their hair they would burn that on the altar. And it was like a symbol that they had devoted themselves to God, and here was the evidence of their time of purity being burnt as an offering to God, an act of devotion and love. So Paul is under no obligation to do things like this, but he loves God, and he's free to observe a particular law if he wants to, even though the law itself, as Paul taught in many places, couldn't save. Paul wasn't doing it for that reason. He was doing it because he loved God and out of reverence and respect for him and devotion. So it says he came to Ephesus, and that was where him and Priscilla and Aquila, his new friends, parted ways. He left Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus, where they stayed for some time. And then, of course, as Paul's custom was, he went into the synagogue just for that day, and then he took off. And the rest of Paul's journey, actually the second journey, ends in this chapter. So in verse 22, it says if I can get my pointer, he sailed from Ephesus, and then he went down into Caesarea, then into Jerusalem, and then he went back up to Antioch. And that, in verse 22, is the end of Paul's second journey. So when you have a look at the purple line, it starts in Antioch, and it goes anti-clockwise around in a weird loopy shape. He's travelled about, I'm just, finger on the map kind of guessing, it's about 4,000 kilometres, and about 2,000 of that is walking. That's just the second journey. So people say that Paul travelled up to 16,000 kilometres throughout all the journeys he did, and a lot of that was on foot. So next time you're whinging about a small hike, have a think about Paul, who walked all that way to bring the gospel, and he didn't have Nikes or, memory foam shoes that he could walk comfortably around in. He had hard sandals that probably worn out. He did that for his master, for his Lord Jesus Christ. And then it says in verse 23 that he commenced his next journey. So the next journey starts in Ephesus, and it says he moves off into the areas in verse 23 of Galatia and Phrygia. Galatia and Phrygia, he went off in this direction around here. And we'll meet up with Paul again in chapter 19. But for now, we're parting ways with Paul, and we're coming back to a new character who we haven't seen before. And the new character is Apollos. And there he is with Aquila and Priscilla, who were tent makers. That's presumably a tent, a stripy tent, that they're stitching while Apollos listens to them talking to him. That's what happens here. So Apollos was, it says, an eloquent man. He was very good at speaking. He was someone that you sat up and listened to. He had a manner about him that would draw people to him when he spoke. And he also knew the scriptures. It says he was mighty in the scriptures. And he comes into Ephesus, and it says he knew only the baptism of John the Baptist. So presumably he was baptised by John, right down there in Jerusalem, outside of Jerusalem, by John, who was this kind of rogue preacher, someone who turned his back on the priesthood. He could have been a priest in Jerusalem, but instead he's out there in the wilderness, eating insects, wearing camel's hair and, not dressed in priestly robes and eating priestly food at all. He's turned his back on all of that, and he's in the wilderness, and people came to him in their thousands to hear his message, which was one of repentance, of turning from your ways, of, reconnecting with God at a much more profound level than the religion of the day, which had pretty much degenerated into corrupt religious service that was ultimately meaningless. And Apollos must have travelled down to that place and heard John, and he's going through the synagogue, just like Paul, trying to convince the Jews about the Messiah, and presumably doesn't really even know who he is. There's something missing in Apollos' understanding. But that didn't hold him back from speaking boldly in the synagogue in verse 26. And Aquila and Priscilla are obviously following Paul's example as well. They're there in the synagogue trying to win over the Jews in that place. And they hear this Apollos person, and they go and take him under their wing. And it says that they explain to him the way of God more accurately. So Apollos then, even though he was a mighty and a powerful speaker, he wasn't too proud to listen to, these two humble servants of Christ who presumably weren't eloquent like him. He could still listen, he could humble himself and take advice from them. And because of that, he became a convert to Christianity. And then he's mentioned in quite a number of places, actually. He's mentioned in Acts chapter 19, when he goes back to Corinth, and he becomes a very central figure in Corinth. They really respected him as a leader and a teacher. So you'll hear more of Apollos for sure as we keep moving through Acts. But he was in Ephesus there, but then it says in verse 27 that he wanted to go into Achaia, which again is that region where Gallio was, of which Corinth was the capital. And we find in chapter 19, that he's in Corinth, so he made it. And he was of a great help to the people in Corinth because he had, that desirable quality of being able to draw people to himself and speak powerfully and refute the Jews who were arguing so strongly against him. And he did great good in that place. So that's chapter 18, really. As we said, it's all about the establishment of the ecclesia in Corinth and also the very start of the ecclesia in Ephesus. So we've met Aquila and Priscilla. We've seen, some sort of ups and downs of Paul while he was in Corinth, and ultimately that triumph he had over the Jews without even opening his mouth. And presumably that helped him and helped the early ecclesias to flourish in those places. We also saw Paul conclude his second journey and start the third journey, which we'll pick up on next week. And we met Apollos, who is one of the formative members of Corinth. Thank you.